Hi, everyone. Welcome back along to the show. Today, I have with me Sathya Bala. She's a specialist in connecting data stories and diversity. She's the founder and CEO at True Change and My Skin, My Story. Sathya, thanks for coming along to the show.
Thanks, Jason, for having me. I'm very excited.
Yeah, me too. And this topic of diversity is a hugely important one. I feel it often gets some airtime, but it's often a bit of a veneer. I really like knowing you and your background now. I want to dig into that topic a bit more, really get under the covers of it, what it means, the impact it has, the approaches people take. But before we do all that, why don't you introduce yourself, a bit about who you are and your background would be great.
Yeah, sure. So a bit about me in a nutshell. And I always kind of weave the personal and the professional because I think, you can't really decouple that as we have learned over the last couple of years. So you might tell from the accent, I grew up in Sydney, Australia. I identify as a Sri Lankan Tamil woman. And then I did the classic thing that every Aussie does in their early 20s. I was like, oh, why not go to London? So I did my schooling, my university, and I started my first job in Sydney. I did IT at uni, and my first job was as a fresh-eyed graduate at Deloitte in kind of risk and audit. So that was a great training ground where they kind of just fling you out there and you kind of sink or swim. And then after 3 years of that, came to London. Very long story short, told my mum I would be here for 18 months. I've been here 14 years. And I continued in kind of risk and audit at Barclays and then at Sainsbury's. And that's where I fell into data and data governance internally at Sainsbury's. Realized I really enjoyed it and wanted to learn more because it was kind of a developing, changing and very new area at the time. I think it still kind of feels like that. In a way that we still feel like we don't have many of the answers, but we're trying. And then, after Sainsbury's, because I wanted to really dig in and kind of learn more about that specialism, I spent 4 years contracting. So I went into the banking world because at the time, they were kind of ahead of the curve because I guess there was regulatory pressures and all of that. And they were more kind of geared up of having data teams, and it wasn't just one person teams, they were real structures. So did that at Barclays, HSBC, Deutsche Bank, did the rounds. And then what coincided with a personal decision, which I'm sure we'll get into, was I wanted to re-enter the permanent world. I had, in the meantime, realized diversity, equity, and inclusion was a real thing in the business world. And I was at that point kind of a leader. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit around, the fact that through being a leader in the package that I am, looking quite young, being relatively young, being a woman of color, a brown woman, I had often felt this responsibility and I guess privilege of being a role model. And so all those things coalesced. And my last job was at Chanel, where I was the head of global data governance there, reporting into the CFO. And I was also a diversity, equity, and inclusion sponsor. And then the last couple of years is where, while I was there, I also kind of leaned into that want to be more intentional with how I supported other women and women of color. And that's why I started the community, My Skin, My Story. And then I took the plunge 6 months ago on the 1st of October. I left Chanel after 18 months, where I learned how to really lean into this piece around data, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I started my own business on that, True Change.
Fantastic. And there's so much there in terms of the journey you've been on and, moving somewhere new, ending up staying there, your personal background, your personal sort of story, your attachment to being from a more diverse background to maybe what you came into. I think you see quite a lot of that in financial services anyway, actually. It'd be quite interesting to hear whether that's a more or less diverse environment than others. But is that kind of your personal background? Has that been the thing that's led you to kind of focusing your attention on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or is it a sort of a bigger problem that you've seen that has sort of led you to go, someone's got to stand up here, and yes, some people do some great things, but I want to be part of the sort of the change that needs to happen?
I think it's both, but it's definitely that personal driver that comes first, because I think how I talk about it is, and language is very important, and it's great that we're starting to, and I know it can be daunting for many people, but we need to learn how to put words, concepts, and definitions to things in the world. Otherwise, we can't really not only tackle them, but the people who face those challenges don't even know how to articulate them. And sometimes they don't feel real. They feel like they're in our heads. So I think that was very much that start of the journey of, it wasn't diversity, equity, and inclusion to me. It was life. It was my life. It was my day to day.
We put a label on it, haven't we?
Yeah, which is great for the business world to give it something, like, because it's something you can then get a budget for, you can get a head count for, it's a team you can build, or it's a initiative you can drive. But if we really peel it back, I think it's the human aspect. And for me, growing up, and then as a child, as a young woman, as an adult, both in my family, my community, my social settings, and in the workplace, this was just my life, and not just mine. It affected all the people I was closest to, because again, through my whole journey, I obviously grew up in the Western part of the world, but my closest people were other people of color and women of color, or sometimes just women in general. And so if you spend your time not just reflecting on how you have to navigate the world, but all the people you love and are closest to are going through that as well, but not necessarily talking about it, because again, it was almost something we were taught to just like, you grin and bear it, just grind, work 5 times as hard, 10 times as hard. I know a lot of people have heard that kind of sentiment. And
is that the reality, Sathya? 5 times, 10 times?
100%. And I would say if you go to spaces, and again, I created My Skin, My Story so there could be a community to have really open conversations with women of color, for women of color, by women of color. And this, I mean, you don't even have to justify yourself. If a woman of color says that in a Zoom room or a real room, every other woman of color will be nodding. But I think outside of that community and other minoritized communities, that's not understood, but it is just a fact. And actually, it's something our parents tell us, even if they don't talk about the why and don't tackle what is racism, what is classism, what is all these things, but they will say, you need to work as hard. The same rules don't apply to you. And not only that, you can't fail. If you make a mistake, it's kind of over. So it's that pressure. But also that understanding that there is a different set of rules, and there are different limitations to how we can succeed. And again, for some people, it's not all. I'm speaking of my experience and the insights from the women of color in my life and in My Skin, My Story. But this is something that we're now trying to shift, right? Of this concept of what are the things that we have been taught to do to survive. And now I think we're in a collective moment, call it diversity, equity, and inclusion, call it social justice. I think the context is different, but the thing is the same. So maybe in the business world, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Maybe in society at large, it is equity, it is social impact, it's human rights. But at the end of the day,
it all connects, right? It all connects. And
exactly. And it's shifting from what are the things we've had to do and we've put up with to survive, to what are the things we need to change structurally so that everyone can thrive.
Yeah.
And I think that requires a shift in structures, but it also requires a shift in the people who belong in dominant groups to be aware of those structures. And then it's also a shift for people who are othered to decondition ourselves, deprogram ourselves from what are the things to accept and actually challenge, but have the strength and support to do it, because there's a burden that comes with that too. So there's a lot there, but it started with, this was just my life. It was affecting me, everyone I cared about. And then someone who has confidence, has a voice, and doesn't feel drain too much when I speak
Mm.
up. So I was like, if not me, who? Because
Mm-hmm.
I've got that leadership respect. I've done my time and done really well in my career where people listen to me and I can disrupt. So actually, if
Yeah.
not me, who?
So hearing your background is there's so much to unpack there in terms of what's what's needed in business, what is needed in society, how people can get behind it, what people need to think. I suppose my own personal angst in this topic is, I'm from a privileged group of society. I'm a white guy. I'm from London. I've got a beard. I'm stereotypical, not the guy to fix this at all. And I have a level of angst that goes, what's my right to even be part of this conversation? And so I'm hoping to learn a load from this conversation, but also understand from what is genuinely valuable to support this cause, I suppose, because this isn't just about ticking a box of saying like I'm helping with diversity or I'm involved in the conversation. It's about genuine change and about genuine improvement. And if this conversation can help that, great. But if what happens after this conversation can transform and support progress, then that's awesome. So I suppose that the question really is trying to unpick some of that stuff that you talked about around the important topics with, I think we're going to abbreviate diversity, equity, inclusion as DEI. But what are the important topics? So if people are interested in understanding what it is that people really need to do here to make some improvement, make some progress, what is it that people need to sort of start thinking about?
Yeah. Before I kind of answer the broad question, because I think people share your angst, it can feel like a big topic, but I think there's something around identifying your own kind of privilege and power and using it as a power, right? So just like, I mean, how many Marvel and DC films and TV shows are out there right now? But that whole, I don't know who started it in the comic world, but with great power comes great responsibility. And that for me, substitute the power with the privilege bit. But also those powers are really cool. So like, let's not be
worried
ashamed
about
of
them.
them. And actually, the whole point is, yes, with great power comes great responsibility, but also like in that world, you can also fly and you can bring other people with you and do all this other like super cool stuff. And that is kind of the thing to have in your mind of like where, even when, I mean, we've been through some tough times. Sometimes we all feel powerless, even people who are told that they have privilege, and it can feel uncomfortable. But it's saying, actually, all of us have some level of power, whether you're, and I'll talk more around specifically in the data world, because I know that's kind of the area we both work in. But, if you go to, so I actually just saw this great thing because I love dance. I'm a kind of personal lifelong obsessive with kind of the arts, music, and dance. And there's this great ballet company called Ballet Black that I love their work. They also do great things. So, for example, they saw their power of not just they wanted to find choreographers and dancers of Black, Brown, and Asian heritage, but they also saw their position in terms of affecting the ballet world. So some people might have caught this. If you watch Glastonbury a few years ago, Stormzy was a headliner. There were a couple of Black ballet dancers, and they were wearing brown-toned ballet shoes. And actually, Ballet Black were an organization, a dance company that drove like one of the first in the UK, which is like, the home of the Royal Ballet, the National Ballet. We have a lot of kind of international dancers that come here. The first company that before then, someone like me had to wear those pink slippers. Why are they pink? To reflect white skin.
White skin. Yeah.
What does it look like on us? A little bit crazy. And not just that, it affects how beautiful the dance is because it's lines. About blending in. It's about lines, extension. So fine, we're not all the heads of ballet companies, but what that company did is I saw they have a great guide of what you can be asking if you put your kids into ballet school. What is, we all have power. There's like 10 things. If you put your kid into a dance class, there's things that you can be saying, hey, are you thinking about this? If your kids go to school, what are you doing to make sure that things around curriculum are being challenged? If you're someone who wants to give back, how are we kind of creating space so that if you have power, podcasts like this, what do your guests look like? Because actually inherently in society, I don't have access to networks and power as easily as you do. And so I think this point to what you were saying before of what's your right to this conversation, actually, it's about using your time, your connections and effort. But I think where the line is then when you're trying to solve these things, it's not about coming up with the solutions without the people who are impacted by it.
Yes, that's
right?
a good point.
That's the distinction. But the people impacted by it don't actually have, it's down to the people in dominant groups to do a lot of the work and get that kind of power and support to drive the solutions, because actually the people who are affected don't have it, but we know what the problems are and can advise on those solutions. So I think that dynamic's important.
Yeah, that's some really, really great tips there, and just giving the confidence to say, look, don't be anxious about it. Use your position, use your role to help advance this conversation is a really great steer. There seems to be, to me, quite a fine line in corporate world with this around kind of looking like you're doing something, or the marketing around doing something and actually making change. How do organizations start to make sure that it's not just being seen to do the right thing and actually doing the right thing?
Yeah, and this is where I think the data and stories bit is really important, because I kind of describe who I am and what I do as a Venn diagram, right, of data, stories, diversity, equity, inclusion. To me, right, with any business challenge, like we wouldn't say, okay, there's a poor performing product, so we'll just kind of like tell a lot of people about it. We won't dig into the reasons why. We won't dig into the data. We won't track it. We really assume that we can do anything to really drive, improve performance. I think the thing here is, yes, diversity, equity, and inclusion has emotional impact. It has a social impact, but it is a business problem. So why would we try and tackle it in any other way? So to me, to move it from words to something with substance and to drive kind of true change is about saying, actually, the data, what's the data out there to help? And this is where people in the data world, like, put your hand up. People trying to drive this change, they're inundated, they're overwhelmed, they're not going to come to us. If you work in data analytics, if you work in data governance, if you work in data science, there's so many skills around. We are the pros at taking a complex business problem and saying, what's the data strategy we need to help deliver that? Because actually data is like one of the primary levers to create any real change. How do we use data to kind of figure out where the problems are? How do we use data to then target initiatives based on that? And how do we use data to drive transparency, accountability, reporting, and measurement? And who's good at that?
So we are. data. So, but is there a stage before that, though, of recognizing that there is a problem? Is that a problem in its own right? Do organizations recognize there's an issue here? And I can see, and we should come on to it, how data can be used to sort of show where that problem is. But what are we talking about when we say there is a problem here, and then understand that something needs to be fixed? So how do you start to recognize that there is an impact to this topic?
So this is where, it is as easy as a very quick Google search. I think there is so much information out there in terms of studies, in terms of research, in terms of just expectations, where I think it's a matter of not, is it important, but we're running out of time to address it, because actually it is going to be a business differentiator. It already is. So I think, there's so many studies. A lot of people refer to the McKinsey report, which talks about that there is statistics and data behind actually the benefits in terms of innovation, in terms of talent, in terms of
the benefits of having a diverse workforce.
Right? Yeah, exactly. But not only that, it is, I would say we need to be on the same approach as what happened with kind of climate and what's going on with environment, social and governance, ESG, where climate is a big part of it, of actually there is growing demand. So to me, the importance, and this is often what I talk about in my work. Whenever I'm about to run a training or a session, I talk about what's the macro picture. And actually, if you look at the macro picture, this is not an optional. This having diversity, equity, and inclusion be something real in your workforce and in your impact as a business provider, service provider, is really critical, because investors now are looking at non-financial performance, and things like business social impact, which is the end result of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Things like climate are being assessed hugely. Again, so many studies to say basically 9 out of 10 investors now look at that to value an organization. Reporting demands, I mean, board diversity is now there are targets for that set by some of the key stock exchanges. So FTSE 100 in the UK, NASDAQ in the US, more and more there is reporting requirements around the social element of ESG. There is reporting requirements on gender pay, but we know that companies are already starting to do ethnicity pay reporting in certain parts of the world, because they know that even if it's not legal, people are expecting it. And that takes us to the people demands of actually trust, what a future employer looks like, who are customers willing to spend their money on. This is now one of the number one drivers of actually demonstrating your values as an organization. Talent and customers are asking these questions. And then not only that, if you look at the industry, just look around at your peers. You know, there are so many people making statements, reporting publicly, mobilizing across industries. So I saw this great thing with the airline industry, where they've now got across airlines, they have a standard around driving more senior women in leadership. And this is like mobilization across the board. So I think it's more around having these conversations and equipping leaders, decision makers to realize that it's not, is this important? It's more like, when will it be too late? You know, because you're going to stand out. I think it's going to be something that devalues your organization if you're not doing it for real. And the last thing I'd say on that, there was this great BCG poll around, actually it's quite dangerous where we are, where 1 in 3 people who are surveyed, it was about 1,000 people in the UK, people will consider leaving an organization if they see that statements are being made and actions not being taken on DEI. Right. So that's powerful, right? That's 30% of people. There's just a lot building. And I think at the end of the day is, we didn't wait for all our leaders to become Greenpeace supporters before climate reporting, commitments, reporting, accountability, transparency was a must-have. So I also think, yes, we need to bring people along the journey, but it is also a business imperative. Everyone doesn't have to believe in it. And actually, the leaders who do will stick around. The ones who don't will have to kind of adjust, because climate has become a reality. Those reports come out just like financial reports, but not everyone there is probably living a carbon neutral life. And we don't expect that for the business to be able to act. And I think we need that balance here.
It's really interesting, the answer you gave there, because I think most of that is the imperative, the need, the demand, the impact it will have on shareholders, stakeholders, customers, almost the stick. And actually what I assumed, clearly wrongly, you would come at it more of a it's the right thing to do kind of angle. And of course it's the right thing to do, but I think your point is really important, and what I'm starting to see more and more in a couple of areas is it has to be more than just doing the right thing, because it's not energized enough, and it doesn't get enough people behind the mission if it just feels like the right thing to do. There has to be a reason. You have to have some accountability and some responsibility to making the change, rather than just feeling like it's the right thing to do, rightly or wrongly. But that seems to be that kind of one of the learnings I've had over the last few years. We're looking at sort of getting B Corp certified, and part of that is about that we do all the right, we feel like we do the right things. Culturally, we're aligned to creating a better society and caring about more than just profit. But B Corp certification holds you to account to those things. It gives you a framework to do it. And I think what you're saying is the same in this area. You have to have a framework and a genuine reason that impacts the organization, at its heart essentially, and its brain, and DEI I think is in that space right now. from what you're
Yeah, and
saying.
I think it's also, I think for me, because it is obviously the right thing to do, I don't spend that long on it. And I think
Talking about it,
you'll
yeah.
find a
Is
lot
it
of
though?
people.
Is it though, Sathya?
Yeah, it is. And
As in, what I mean by that is, do you think enough people feel it is the right thing to do?
well, so to that point, I think it's because I feel strongly that way. And it's the people who are impacted by the inequities that exist now. So
Yes.
this is
Yeah.
the thing, right? So if you asked a bunch of people who are negatively impacted by how things work, and I'm one of those people, but it could be anything. It could be class, sexuality, ability, so many things, the way people think, the way people learn. Actually, a lot of this works for very few people in the world. You know, people say ethnic minority, global majority. It's because actually most of us do not follow, tick off the characteristics where things are easy in this world. So I think when you look at those people,
Yeah.
from experience, it is kind of of course, it feels that way because I know it, I feel it. But I think this is where we need to connect to the stories piece, which is the other bit of the puzzle I'm passionate about, is where the way things work is often the people with the decision makers, the leaders, the gatekeepers, historically have not been the people who have that knowledge by default from lived experience,
Yeah.
which is why I think you need the data and the stories. It's not just a stick, you know, the data piece, the demands, actually there's a lot of value. So it's not just that we have to do this, or we'll get in trouble. It's also, if we want to innovate, if we want to be an attractive
It's much more
employer, for
progressive
me, that's all carrot.
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
not stick.
Yeah.
But then the stories bit is around keeping that commitment and making sure that the people who don't necessarily feel they have skin in the game to realize. And to me, that's where stories are important, sharing that lived experience and not just kind of farming that for free. I think it's also really important to pay external speakers. When you have people running your employee resource groups, make sure they are rewarded, because again, we are just perpetuating the history of this type of knowledge being taken for granted and done for free, right? Because we don't value that coming from people, minoritized backgrounds. So use those stories, but make sure that those people are being rewarded for that. Stories for me is around commitment, shedding a light, and making the data and the facts humanized and real, to be like, actually, this is the right thing to do. Whenever we get lost, whenever we get a little bit kind of, lose a bit of hope because it's been like one step forward, a couple steps back, because this work is hard and things will go wrong a bit. That means you're doing it right. But we need the stories to keep the faith, keep the commitment, keep the energy levels, and make those people who perhaps don't have that connection to it in reality realize that it's about them too. Because I think, and then I'll stop, but I think it's important to say that, yes, I know it to be the right thing to do, and I know these things from my lived experiences, but this is not about other people losing power, or if it's a pie, reducing the slice of one person's pie and increasing the other.
People don't lose here.
Yeah, we're talking about increasing the whole pie, because actually, you know, whether people realize it or not, this system also doesn't work for straight white men either. It doesn't. You know, it is harder to lead. It's harder to find talent. Actually, none of us are at our best if we're not bringing in the best and have that diversity of thought and experience. We all actually suffer from it. It's just that for some people, it's more obvious than others. And I think that's where the storytelling is really important.
Just one thing I haven't yet asked is I'm not talking to a dictionary definition, but the difference, or maybe more importantly, the balance of the differences between diversity, equity, and inclusion, because they do mean something different, but to get the collective, I think, is quite important as well. So just, if we take a step back for a minute, what's the difference from your perspective?
Yeah, so for me, so diversity is very much around looking at the representation and the characteristics of groups of people, right? And I think as just a straight off the mind to contextualize it in business, as a baseline, we should all be working towards whatever we do and wherever we work, do our people reflect the communities and the world that we serve?
Yeah. Right.
And the answer is often no.
Yeah.
Because that just means that we are not bringing in those voices, and we will then definitely be missing and underserving those components of the community. And also we will lose that diversity of thought. So I think it's important. Some people think diversity of thought is like a softer, nicer way to talk about it. But where does diversity of thought come from? From diversity of background as well. So they're connected. Then the inclusion bit is around, you can bring all these people in, but if they're still being excluded, or their voices aren't being heard, or they're not able to be feeding into decisions, well, then that's not effective. So what are we doing to make sure that everyone can contribute, is part of decision-making processes? And then to me, the end game is equity, which is the only reason we do all of this is to drive impact. And right now there are inequities. And that's to say that people start at different starting points. I think people might have seen pictures and metaphors of like a sports game or a running track. We're at different starting points. We need different interventions to get to the same, start line, so that we have a fair chance to get to that finish line, right? Because it's not a fair race. And that's kind of the equity piece. So we do all of these things to
in
drive
order to
equity.
generate equity. Yeah. And of course, there's a long way to go for that, and I suppose across the world as well, it's equity is at different ends of the spectrum, from very equitable to not very equitable, and so I think so I think I get sort of your use of kind of storytelling to help people understand this problem, understand why it's an issue, understand where the opportunity is, understand why it's important. There's storytelling to help kind of develop a set of frameworks or approaches or activities that improve the situation. And then I guess there's storytelling which closes the loop on the good things that have happened, the positive things that have happened, that off the back of the work that's done. Is there like a way that organizations can start, I suppose? Are there some key activities, and how does data play into that?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about, specifically if I'm speaking to people in the data world, I talk a lot about the term equity by design. I think a lot of us remember, actually, whether you work in data or not, a lot of us remember, I don't know, was it 5 years ago, maybe more, privacy regulation came in and everyone was freaking out and everyone was like, right, what's the silver bullet here? And then people quickly realized there was no silver bullet. We went down this approach of privacy by design, which is to say, actually, whatever our core processes are, we need to build this into different stages, right? Yeah. And again, with my background in audit and risk, I know this to be true. We only fundamentally change things when we create interventions, put controls in, and evolve our processes and our systems, right? Otherwise, it's not baked, as you said. So equity by design, this is wherever you work. So if you're in procurement, how are we building equity by design so that actually when we are looking for suppliers, are we tapping into networks of suppliers that are owned by minority groups? Are we looking at our payment terms? Because actually they might be smaller businesses. They might be businesses that have less capital because unfortunately, I think there's a study out there that said like venture capitalists only fund 1% of their money to businesses run by Black women. So like, there's already these hurdles, but can we have different payment terms so that actually cash flow is easier for those people? Can we make those hurdles less? So, what is that whole thing across the process? If you work in product development, how are we actually building this in terms of building in that innovation by looking at where is our lack of representation? All of us work in teams where more diversity would help, but that doesn't solve the problem by itself. How do we create the intervention so that actually when we're delivering a data-driven innovation, are we testing it and bringing in different voices? Are we actually perhaps bringing in the public because we miss some of that diversity internally? So I think there is so much, but it's about using that power that we have to build, right? Just like with privacy by design, how could we make whatever this process is, whatever our team is, more equitable? And I think, as a starting point, there's probably kind of 5 things. How can we start to really If we've got the power, use the data to actually reveal where the challenges are. So, or if we don't have the power, start demanding and being that grassroots, bottom-up employee base to say, actually, leaders, you said all these nice things. Where's the data? So, like, what does diversity look like in our workforce? Where are we really underrepresented? How do people feel about inclusion? What do our engagement surveys say? Are we adding enough of these questions into our engagement surveys? And then are we actually putting measurements in place so that we can talk about it? And if we're nowhere near any of that, what are the 3 things we want to start with? Because I bet even without any data, an organization can say, actually, there's 3 things we know we could be doing better.
Yeah.
So in parallel, let's not wait for that data to start taking action. Maybe it's the fact that our recruitment process, we know that our candidate pool, always kind of looks the same. We always go to certain universities. Let's change that. Let's start doing outreach at other universities. I know for me, as a head of data, hiring and building teams, I built relationships as an individual with organizations like Black in Data and Women in Data so that I could post my job descriptions on their job boards. Super simple.
Yeah.
Every field has networks like that. So I think, look at what it is in our power, but, come up with 3 things. And one of those things should be educate ourselves. There's so much out there. Find the medium that works for you. Maybe it's podcasts, maybe it's TV shows, whatever it is, and actually start to consume and understand what other people's perspectives are. Because I think the personal commitment angle is important. We all need to put effort into it.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that certainly it can feel overwhelming if you think about the whole topic, but breaking it down into something that I can actually make some change here. I can do something right now. I mean, one of the challenges in recruitment, for example, is that there aren't the skills in some of the underrepresented groups. So you sort of have this catch-22 of, well, we want to create some opportunity and create a more diverse workforce, but the community of people that have the skills required to do the work. So there's kind of like a supply chain, if you like, of solving those problems. But I think across the industry, different people can solve these things in different ways. But the sort of net effect of the contribution should be that it sort of elevates, the ability to have a more diverse workforce.
But I mean, I will throw in a controversial challenge to that, because I think actually there's been a lot of work on this. And most of the time, the talent is there. We're just not tapping into it. So I think we also need to not fall onto that as the reason. So, I mean, there was this great piece of work done by an organization that assesses STEM, I think it's globally, STEM talent. And I mean, there's, a huge untapped part of talent is returners. And when this study talked to actual people who are in this field, and actually the barriers in the recruitment process are huge based on this study. Right. So actually, I think we need to challenge that and say, actually, the people are there, and the people who are there aren't getting anywhere near the start of the process. So actually, how do we, in parallel, yes, we need to build, there is a scarcity of talent, just generally, if you ask people in data or in STEM. So that hasn't stopped us in any other thing. Why would scarcity in one specific area seem to propose a different challenge? But I think we really need to kind of start looking at the fact, why is it that there are so many people who take career breaks? It could be mums, it could be whoever, and they're really struggling to get back into the field. How are we really utilizing people who want to change careers? And actually, I have a lot of friends who are returning mums. One of my best friends, she wanted to retrain and come into the data world, but there was no real pathway for her. So that it won't take much, but I think it's just challenging some of these things. And, we're all humans. We're used to doing things a certain way. We have our go-to people, our go-to networks. It takes some time, some creativity and effort to be oh, actually, I was always looking here and this looks like there's a lack of talent, but I wasn't looking. If I
change,
the perspective, right? And so I think we do just need to be careful that we don't fall on to that, because there's now more and more information to say that that's not necessarily the issue.
Yes, I think sticking with that assumption is a problem.
Yeah.
But knowing where to look, knowing where to go, knowing who those people are to open up those opportunities, I think is the work, right? It's to make sure there's a voice, to make sure they're bubbling up to the top of the surface, so that people can really tap into that great thing. And I think this disconnect between scarcity of resource and a whole bunch of people that are crying out for some more work it's crazy. So how do we connect those dots? I think is really important going forward. Brilliant. Well, it's been fascinating talking to you, Sathya. As I said, I have some of my own personal angst on this topic. Do you say the wrong thing? Do you put the right effort in the right place? Do you contribute in a positive and productive way? So I'm hoping that that other people get some real value from listening to you talk in this conversation, but also can really move the agenda forward in their organization, or just in some small way in their team. So thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you. And I would leave people with one takeaway, which is, if you feel comfortable, just even have one conversation with your team and start sharing a bit of your story. Because the magical thing that happens is when leaders or team leaders or just your colleagues start to share a bit, and we all have reasons why we feel like in the past we haven't had a fair shot at something. And even if that feeling and that story, all you can say is, Jason, what you said is, as kind of perhaps a middle-class white man, I don't know, and I struggle and I have angst on this, and I know I will make mistakes, but I'm still going to do it. That creates a change in terms of the energy and the comfort and the freedom to actually talk about things we never talked about actually at work, and actually to start looking at ideas. And even if it's having a conversation with your team and saying, hey, over the next month, I'd love to hear ideas where you think we could be a more diverse and inclusive team. There's no crazy ideas. Let's make it fun. There is so much that we can do, but we don't have to do it alone. So kind of use the people that you work with that are in your community, and start to share and break the taboo. Because the more time we waste on fear of this, the time is wasted on making change.
Yeah, totally. Love it. Well, really, really good advice there, Sathya. Thank you for that. And thank you once again for coming on the show. It's been brilliant talking to you. And I look forward to continuing to engage on this topic with you and others.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show, and catch you next time.